pray these things in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. My doctor says I'm in very good health, but my gosh, I have to pop my back like every couple hours. I said, is that a problem? He's like, nah, some people just do. And I was like, okay. If I find out you're wrong later, I'm going to be mad. Well, our lesson today is addressing the question, was Jesus crazy? Did everybody get a chance to read or at least skim through the chapter on whether or not Jesus was crazy this week? Anybody have any thoughts about this chapter? Anything that stuck out to you? It can be good or bad.
One thing that stuck out to me was the part about the part about exorcism.
Yeah.
That whole section.
Sure. Yeah.
Was something I had never thought about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a real thing. That's good. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So some form of exorcism has been observed in basically every known culture throughout all of history. I don't think they talk about it much in this chapter. I think they might talk about it either in a later chapter or in a different book by Lee Strode. But there have been a number of kind of high-profile U.S. court cases that revolved around exorcisms. You ever seen the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose? So it's based on a true story about a girl. I don't know if her name is actually Emily Rose. I think they might have changed her name for the movie, but I don't know. We'll just call her Emily. There was a girl named Emily who was by all appearances possessed by a demon. Like, she would speak in a voice that was literally too low for a teenage girl's vocal cords to produce. She would float off the ground, other things like that. I think some police officers observed her crawling up a wall and onto the ceiling, right? So there was like demonic activity happening. So naturally the family got their local priest involved. The priest got clearance from the Vatican to do an exorcism. That's actually very difficult. Like, there's this myth that goes around that the Catholic Church just goes around doing exorcisms kind of willy-nilly. The reality is it can take months for clearance to come through to get an exorcism, because the Vatican is very, very picky, very stringent on who they can clear for an exorcism. They make you go through several different rounds of verification before they'll even start to talk about allowing a priest to come and do an exorcism. But Emily Rose, she received clearance, so the priest comes in and he performs this exorcism. It goes on for several weeks, because evidently a lot of times it can take a very long time. It's, there will be a lot of marathon sessions of trying to cast out this demon. And during that time, the just intensity and the stress of the exorcism, she ends up dying from exhaustion, I think, is all that was listed on her death report. Right? They couldn't find a clear cause of death. All they could attribute it to was exhaustion. Just her senses were so overwhelmed, she actually died. So the state of Maryland, I think, is where it took place. I believe it was Maryland. The state of Maryland needed somebody to crucify for her death, right? They needed somebody to blame, and so they tried to prosecute the priest who was performing this exorcism. One of the things that happened was they brought in a whole bunch of psychologists, a whole bunch of anthropologists, a whole bunch of people who basically specialize in like varying cultures and specialize in the way the human brain works. And one of the things they all consistently testified to was that exorcism is a universal thing. Some form of exorcism exists in every single culture. But one of the things they also said is that part of what they think exorcism does is it fulfills like a psychological need in some people. There will be some people who have either this mental disorder or something like that, and for whatever reason the experience of an exorcism has been beneficial. And so today, even like in places like New York and in Los Angeles, where a lot of kind of cutting edge like specialists are working, they'll actually, psychologists and stuff like that will use exorcisms as part of their therapeutic treatments for patients, which is really interesting. Sometimes that goes well, sometimes that goes very poorly. There's one story, I wish I remembered the name of the psychologist, and I wish I remembered the name of the patient, but there was this one psychologist who he was using exorcism for all of his patients who had really, really serious psychological disorders. And so one time he did like I think 36-hour marathon exorcism session with this rich patient of his. He was trying to exorcise all these extra personalities she had, because she had some like extreme version of multiple personality disorder. And so he would like exercise this personality for a few hours, then exercise this personality for a few hours, then exercise this personality for a few hours. Apparently one personality was like she thought she was possessed by the ghost of some old serial killer from the 1920s. One personality was like she thought she was possessed by like an old black jazz saxophonist from like the jazz age. One of the personalities was she thought she was possessed by a duck, which is interesting. I would have liked to have seen that, right? But so he's doing this marathon exorcism session. But the bottom line for all of this is whether you're going way outside the U.S. to other cultures, or you're going into kind of the heart of even like the secular world, like the professional academic world, exorcism is like a universal phenomenon. But one of the things that comes with that is that a lot of skeptics believe that when Jesus is performing exorcisms in the Gospels, it's basically just something like those psychologists performing exorcisms on people with multiple personality disorder. So a lot of skeptics argue that the stories of demonic possession are really just stories of people who have some kind of psychological disorder that somehow Jesus figured out how to treat. That's part of what skeptics say about Jesus. Now, later in our lesson, we'll talk a little bit about why that doesn't really work. But that is one of the things that skeptics say. But so today, the big thing we want to talk about is whether or not Jesus was crazy. We established last week, if you want to watch the video on our Facebook account or our YouTube account, you can. It's, I think, about an hour. We talked about the claims that Jesus makes about himself. A lot of skeptics like Bart Ehrman or John Hick, the Quran, others like that, they'll say that the real Jesus never claimed to be God, that the real Jesus just claimed to be a man who spoke for God, but that later down the line, later Christians in the later church falsely said that Jesus was God, and that they went on and basically built a whole religion around the idea that Jesus was God. But what we found last week when we combed through, honestly, it felt like about 100 different passages from the four Gospels. It kind of felt like it was never going to end, didn't it? But we just went one passage after another, where Jesus very clearly claims to be the God of the universe. Jesus very clearly, throughout the Gospels, he clearly claims to be the God of the Bible. When Jesus showed up in Galilee, surrounded by Jewish people who believed that the Old Testament was the Word of God, Jesus went to those people and he said, I am the God of the Old Testament. Jesus said, I am the God you read about when you read the Old Testament. And so when we go back to the earliest writings about Jesus, what we find consistently is that Jesus claimed to be God. So, the obvious question we have to ask, once we establish that Jesus clearly claimed to be God, is, was he crazy? Right? Like, honestly, I think that's a reasonable question to ask. I think it's reasonable to ask, was Jesus crazy? The reason being, a lot of people have claimed to be God. This is a list of people who have claimed to be God just within the 21st century, right? Actually, Jim Jones might have been the mid to late 90s. So I Maybe this is the late 20th century. But this is just people who've claimed to be God within the last 30 years or so. First one is Alan John Miller. Alan John Miller was an Australian Jehovah's Witness leader who left the Jehovah's Witnesses, and he started to claim that he was Jesus Christ reincarnated. That is quite the claim, huh? Alan John Miller said, I am Jesus Christ reincarnated. And then after that, he said, my wife, a woman named Mary Suzanne Luck, he said, my wife is Mary Magdalene reincarnated. That's Alan John Miller. Alan John Miller is easily the least interesting of the people who have claimed to be God. Because next up we have David Shailen. Anybody ever heard of David Shailen? He's a little more famous than Alan John Miller. So David Shailen is really interesting. He used to be an MI5 agent. David Shailen was an MI5 agent who left MI5 to become a YouTuber. So he started making YouTube videos where he attempts to prove that he is actually Jesus. According to David Shailen, the 9/11 attacks were faked by the American government. Also, according to David Shailen, he has the divine power to influence the weather. So when it rains, it's David Shailen's fault. He has the divine power to prevent terror attacks. That's why he says 9/11 was fake. He says, I keep preventing terror attacks, and the only reason you heard about 9/11 is because it was faked. Right? And he says he has the divine power to predict football scores. Now, he's talking about soccer because he's British. They call it football because they're stupid, right? So David Shailen says he has the divine power to influence the weather, prevent terrorist attacks, and predict soccer game scores. That's David Shailen. Next up is Todd Kincannon. You guys might actually remember Todd Kincannon. He made local news. Anybody remember Todd Kincannon? It might come back to you when I start explaining it. This all happened about 3 years ago. Todd Kincannon is the former head of the South Carolina Republican Party. He was arrested in 2018 for murdering his mother's dog. Now, when Todd Kincannon was arrested in 2018 for murdering his mother's dog, the police were like, why did you murder your mother's dog? And he said, I murdered my mother's dog because I realized that I'm the second coming of Jesus, and that every 1,000 years there needs to be a sacrifice. Blood must be spilled. That's a direct quote. And he said the dog seemed like the best candidate for the sacrifice. That is Todd Kincannon. He kind of fell there, right? You're the head of a political party, then you kill your mom's dog because you think you're the second coming of Jesus. That's an interesting life trajectory, right? Next up is Michael Joseph Celecchia. I gotta be honest, I just included this one because it has kind of a nice gross out detail there at the end. So Michael Joseph Celecchia was a 19-year-old from Florida. He was in Gainesville, Florida. Anybody ever been to Gainesville, Florida? It's an interesting place. If Angie or Dave were here, I bet they could tell you some stories about Gainesville, Florida. But he was a 19-year-old in Gainesville, Florida, and he went on this rampage in his apartment building. Fortunately, he didn't kill anybody or anything like that, but he went around screaming, I am the true God. That was the first thing he was screaming. And secondly, he was screaming, so can somebody help me cut my penis off? Michael Joseph Celecchia, ladies and gentlemen. So the police arrive, they try to subdue him, and he punches a female police officer out. And then her partners come and they tase him, and they're able to get him into the police car. But as they're booking him into the police car and all the way to the police station, because apparently they had kind of a long drive, evidently he kept trying to convince the police that he is the true God, and therefore he needs them to help him cut his penis off. That is Michael Joseph Celecchia. Now, you do probably remember Jim Jones. He is unfortunately not as funny as Michael Joseph Celecchia. Jim Jones orchestrated the Jonestown mass suicide 918 people drank poison Kool-Aid because Jim Jones convinced them that he is God and that they would make themselves worthy to enter heaven's gates if they would step out in faith and drink the poisoned Kool-Aid. Lastly, you probably do not remember the homeless guy I knew who would hang out outside the Bobcat Country convenience store when I was growing up as a kid. There was a homeless guy who hung out outside the Bobcat Country convenience store when I was growing up in Salina, Texas in the early 2000s. He had a Chihuahua with him. He lurked around the convenience store and he tried to lure you over to talk to him. And if he successfully lured you over to talk to him, he would talk your ear off about how he was the true Jesus come back to earth, and how his Chihuahua was like a little messenger angel or something. Now, one time, some friends of mine made him mad. I don't remember what they did to make him mad, but he got upset with them, so he started chasing after them with a broken bottle. And in the process, his dog got hit by a car, and he just kind of freaked out. We never saw him again. I don't know what he did. I don't know if he went to a different town, got a new Chihuahua, or what. But that's the guy that I personally knew who claimed to be God. So, a lot of people have claimed to be God. But what do all these people have in common?
They got some type of
Crazy.
crazy is the word that comes to my mind.
Yeah. They are all crazy. Everybody we have seen, whether they're on this list or not, who've claimed to be God, have turned out to be crazy. So I think it's actually reasonable to ask, why should we assume it was any different with Jesus? A lot of skeptics have asked exactly that question. They say that if Jesus really said the things the four Gospels record him as saying, they say that if Jesus really claimed to be God on earth, then he was probably insane. Very much the same way these guys are insane. He probably didn't cut his penis off, but insane is insane whether you cut your penis off or not, right? A lot of skeptics say if Jesus really claimed to be God, then Jesus was probably crazy. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think so, because he had proof that backed up a lot of what he did.
Yeah.
I mean, there was significant proof to back up the different things that he did.
That's good.
You know,
Yeah.
like rising from the dead. If that was just him being crazy, there'd have been a body that somebody would have eventually found.
Yeah, that's true. That's good. That's good. Yeah, I like that. So, when evaluating a person's sanity, like whether it's for a trial setting, right? You know, sometimes they have to bring in a renowned psychologist to evaluate whether or not a suspect is sane or is competent to stand trial, right? Because there's a difference in what you're going to do based on that, right? Like if somebody murders their wife, if they're judged to be sane, if they're judged to have been sane when they did that, then you're gonna put them in prison. But if they're judged to have been insane when they did that, you're gonna put them in some kind of hospital for the criminally insane, right? You're gonna deal with people differently based on their sanity. And so a lot of times a psychologist will have to go and they'll have to observe someone, they'll have to talk to someone, and they'll have to diagnose whether or not they are sane or insane. And one of the things consistently that we've found as specialists have tried to diagnose insanity, because it's kind of a slippery term, right? But one of the things that they've consistently found is that disturbed or insane individuals almost always have multiple psychological issues that are intertwined. Does that sentence make sense? A lot of big words in there. But typically, people who are insane, so to speak, have multiple head problems, right? Multiple psychological problems that kind of intertwine with each other. It's unbelievably rare for an insane person to be totally well-adjusted except for their insanity, right? It's very rare to meet somebody who seems totally normal, is totally fine, everything is okay, but they're insane, right? That's unbelievably rare. I know there are a lot of movies and TV shows and stuff like that where there's an insane person that nobody was able to spot, but that's actually really rare in real life, right? It's extremely rare for an insane person to be totally well-adjusted apart from his or her insanity. Most often, if you are insane, if you are delusional, if you lack that kind of baseline sanity that people normally need to have to function in society, usually what ends up happening is you have several psychological issues that kind of combine with each other. And so, for example, there are kind of three categories that you could separate psychological issues into. There are really more than three, but this is just to be simple, right? You could say that there are kind of three levels. There's level one, and these are the really common psychological issues that a lot of perfectly sane people have. Think clinical depression. Think anxiety disorders. Lots of perfectly sane, perfectly normal people suffer from either acute or chronic depression, right? Acute depression is if you have a maybe one-time period of not being able to function because your brain literally kind of turns on you. If you ever went through something unbelievably traumatic or unbelievably tragic or difficult or something like that, and so for maybe a month after that, you could barely get yourself out of bed, right? Your brain literally wouldn't let you, right? That's acute depression. Now, chronic depression, that's what you call it when you are a person who just every several months you go through a period where you lose the ability to motivate yourself to live, basically, right? Lots of perfectly sane people have chronic depression. Similar kind of thing, anxiety disorders, right? Some people have chronic anxiety disorders, and so they go into a store and immediately feel anxious about having to talk to the cashier, or they go into church and immediately feel anxious about having to talk to the people there, or they go driving and they immediately feel anxious about whether they're going to get to their destination, or whether a deer is going to run out in front of them, or whether a car is going to come on the wrong side of the road and hit them, right? That's an anxiety disorder. A lot of times, in most cases, if you have an anxiety disorder, you'll feel anxious about nothing. Ever felt anxious about nothing? I frequently feel anxious about absolutely nothing, right? There's nothing I'm nervous about in particular. There's nothing I'm worried about coming up in particular, but there's this feeling of doom just hanging over me. You ever had that? There's nothing to be afraid of, and yet you just feel this sense of absolute doom, this oppressive, it feels almost like a piano is just hanging over you, and it's going to drop, and you don't know when, and you don't know why, right? That's how it is a lot of times with an anxiety disorder. These are very common psychological issues that plenty of sane people have. I have both of these things. I'd be willing to bet that at least a few of you have one or both of these things yourself. They're both very common. You can live a perfectly reasonable life with them, but they create some issues. This is kind of like level one. This is the shallow end of psychological issues. But you move a little further out into the waters, and you get a little bit deeper. You get into kind of level two psychological disorder. Think of angry outbursts. You ever known somebody who would just kind of lose control of their emotions, and they would suddenly have this furious outburst over nothing? Like they slightly overcooked dinner, and they go nuts, right? Like there's a difference between just kind of getting mad in reaction to something, and then this kind of madness that just sort of like takes over you. You ever seen something like that? Maybe you've been married to somebody who was like that at some point. But angry outbursts that go way beyond what normal people experience. There's a kind of, I don't know what you would call it, but they're disorders that will cause you to have full-on outbursts of anger that you are incapable of controlling. I was friends with a guy here in this area for about 6 months last year, and I literally had to stop talking to him because he had some kind of emotional disorder that caused him to have these extreme outbursts, and he would say the most vile things to you. He would say the most horrific and abusive things to you. He would lose his ever-loving mind if you stepped on the wrong tripwire. Right? It was impossible to maintain a relationship with him. It was impossible to communicate with him because every time you did it, you would have to wonder, when's the next time he's going to fly off the handle and burn you, right? And so I had to literally cut off a friendship with a person because they had this angry outburst disorder, this psychological disorder that caused them to totally lose control of their emotions. Frequently, this will lead to things like domestic violence, right? Or if it doesn't lead to domestic violence, it'll just lead to other wildly unhealthy relationships with your kids or with your friends or with your spouses or with the people at your church. And so this can cause significantly more serious kind of interpersonal issues. In the same way, paranoia, right? Ever met somebody who was legitimately paranoid? Somebody who they see some kind of threat in everything. And so they won't go out and, go eat at a restaurant with you, because if they do that, then somebody will be watching them, right? Somebody will be listening to them, right? I knew this guy back when I was in college, and it was bizarre. I didn't know it at the time, but he had a kind of paranoid personality disorder. I don't know the exact name of it, but we would be like at a coffee shop or something like that, and we would be talking, and he would just like turn over to the person next to him and be like, "Excuse me, can I help you?" They'd be like, "What?" And he'd be like, "Is there a reason you're listening to our conversation?" He'd be like, I'm not. And he'd be like, mind your own business. Like, look back over there, And it was just everywhere, right? He would see some kind of threat everywhere. He would see some kind of something to be concerned about everywhere. He was paranoid that people were spying on him, that people were listening to him, so on and so forth. That can be a sign of like early onset schizophrenia or something else like that. But paranoia, that's one of the common symptoms when you have a somewhat deeper sort of psychological issue. And paranoia usually comes along with conspiratorial thinking. That conspiratorial thinking, that's kind of like the conspiracy theorists, right? Except most of us know at least a few conspiracy theorists, right? We've got an uncle or something like that. Somebody who we see every Thanksgiving, and every time we get there, they want to talk about how the government's plotting to, take away all our rights or something like that, A lot of people didn't want to get the vaccine because they think the government's going to track you, right? It's like, dude, you got a smartphone, you're being tracked. Like, come on. You've been being tracked since like the 70s. Get real, right? That's not conspiratorial thinking. That's garden variety, That's the normal type of just conspiracy theorism. Humans are wired in a way that we just naturally see connections that aren't really there. That's part of how we're wired. It's a survival instinct. For a very long time, the people in their tribes who survived the best were the ones who were the most on edge, who were looking out for danger the most. And so naturally, just generally speaking, we all sort of developed in a way that we see connections that aren't there. A lot of times we'll see dangers that are not really there. A lot of times we'll see threats that are not really there. That's how you end up conspiracy theorism. That's how you end up as a conspiracy theorist. But this is a different thing. There are full-on disorders that can make you pathologically bent towards conspiratorial thinking. This is not the conspiracy theorist uncle that you have that shows up at Thanksgiving. This is that lady who lives in your apartment building who keeps knocking on your door at 2 a.m. saying, the government's in my room and they're trying to take me. I need your help, right? There was this lady, she lived in the same building as my friends Garrett and Jess, and she said she had cracked the secret Hebrew end times code. I don't know what that means, right? But she said, I have all the files. I know when the Antichrist is coming, and so Obama's after me. This is 2015, so you still. She said, like, I was brushing my teeth and I saw him in the mirror, you know. It was like, okay, all right, okay, you know. But so she was hardcore about that. So she would follow Garrett around when he left for work. She would follow Jess around when she was like doing the laundry in the middle of the day. She was impossible to escape. So they literally had to figure out where she went and when and why, right? They had to start like watching, they had to start spying on her to figure out her routine. So her fears came true, right? But they had to do that so they could figure out how to avoid her, right? Like she would get up and go out this exit on this day at this time. So they'd say, okay, Tuesday, we got to go out the back to avoid crazy Hebrew end times code lady, right? They'd say like on Thursday, we've got to go out the side exit to avoid crazy Hebrew end times code lady and stuff like that. But then crazy Hebrew end times code lady started coming to the tech repair shop that I worked at to get us to fix her computer. She'd say, I have all these files about the end times and the Antichrist, but the government keeps deleting them when I'm asleep, and I need you to find them for me. And I was like, okay. Listen. Our labor fee is non-refundable, and so if you pay us to try and find secret files the government deleted from your computer while you were asleep, and we don't find any files, you can't have your money back. I want you to understand that. And she was like, I understand. And I was like, okay. And so we went on, and naturally there were no files because they don't exist, because she was pathologically conspiratorial in her thinking, right? She had a psychological disorder. And so she comes back to pick up her computer, and she's like, oh, that's okay. And so we give it back to her. You know, she doesn't demand a refund or anything. She comes back like a week later, and she's like, I got all the files back, but they deleted them again when I was asleep. So can you go and try to find them? Maybe this time you'll get them. And I was like, ma'am, I cannot in good conscience take your money. Those files don't exist. And she's like, then God do you do? And so, you know, there's this pathological kind of conspiratorial thinking. Think of like the QAnon cult, right? The QAnon cult it's filled with people who have this sort of pathological, sort of conspiratorial bent that goes beyond just the kind of normal. It's fun to conspiracy theorize, right? It's fun to do that. It's enjoyable. 90% of the time, it's harmless. But this is something that goes beyond that. A lot of times, people who are certifiably insane, what you'll find is there will be a conspiratorial bent to their thinking that goes well beyond your conspiracy theorist uncle. It becomes debilitating. It makes it impossible to have a functional life. That's kind of the second level of psychological disorders we could talk about. But then there's a third level that actually goes even beyond this, because even crazy Hebrew end times code lady, right? She was able to maintain something of a functional life. I don't remember what her job was, but she had a job. She was able to do that job, right? She had children and grandchildren. She was not a danger to her children or grandchildren. She was just weird. And yet there's a sort of a third level that can often make it absolutely impossible to live. And that is an inability to think in a clear, logical, linear fashion. You ever met somebody who was incapable of thinking in a clear or logical or linear fashion? It's kind of like if you've ever had a conversation maybe with somebody you didn't know, maybe somebody you meet at a restaurant, or on a trip or something like that, and they start talking to you, and as they're talking, they just suddenly completely move out into like the stratosphere, right? So like I met this guy one time. I don't know if I've told this story or not before, but I was working as a server at an IHOP. If you want to meet weird people, work as a server at an IHOP. Work at any breakfast joint. The weirdest people all go to the breakfast joints. I don't know why. I don't know if there's a relationship between breakfast and psychological issues, but I guess all people with psychological issues do have to eat breakfast, right? So, there's that. But so there's this guy. The name he told us was John Black. I don't know if that was really his name, but he always went by John Black, and he always referred to himself in third person. So he would say, John Black wanted some pancakes this morning. So John Black came here to IHOP. And I was like, oh, is he meeting you here? And he's like, John Black is me. I was like, okay, John Black. All right. Anyways, but so he would start talking. You would ask him like, well, what can I get for you, John Black? And he'd be like, John Black would like the triple stack pancakes. John Black has been drinking these protein smoothies lately because John Black's trying to put on weight. I'd say, good for John Black. And he'd be like, yeah, I was 130 pounds, and then I started taking these protein shakes, and John Black got to 150 pounds. I was like, okay, that was desirable. He's like, and then John Black kept at it. Now John Black's at 180. And I was like, okay. And he would just look really, really, like he would look at you really earnestly. Like he was really, I don't know, like he was really invested in what he was talking to you about. He was like, I think John Black's going to go for 200. I was like, you want anything with your pancakes, John Black? Anyways, but then he would move on. He's like, once John Black hits 200, then his wife can come down from space. I was like, oh, the plot just escalated. He's like, John Black has to marry his bride, but he's looking for her here. And I was like, I thought she was coming down from space. He was like, John Black has to find her. She's hiding. Once John Black finds his bride here, then she can come down from space. And I was like, well, what about the 200 pounds thing? And he was like, what? I was like, right, so this is an inability to think in a clear, logical, linear fashion. It's like his brain literally, most of us think, not necessarily in a straight line, but most of us think, at the very least, it's kind of like you start here, right? Your thought starts here and you go kind of all over here, right? We have spaghetti brains. Like our brains literally look like spaghetti. Like seen a brain, it looks like spaghetti, right? So our thought process will be like that. But if you are certifiably insane, a lot of times what will happen is your thought process will look a little more like this. Here's the starting point. And then somehow you're over here now. Right? And then somehow you're over here now. I know this is a really, really deep point for our Bible study, right? But now you're over here, right? And then you get over here, and here's your ending point. There's no coherence to that, right? There's no inner logic to it. You literally lack the ability to think in a clear, concise, logical, reasonable line. You are incapable of thinking clearly the way that most other people are. And in the same way, an inability to relate to others. Have you ever met someone who literally could not relate to other people in any way at all? Who literally could not develop relationships with other people in any functional form? They were literally incapable of developing real friendships. They were incapable of maintaining a relationship with their kids. They were incapable of having any sort of real community. They just couldn't relate to other people. They couldn't maintain a functional relationship. a lot of times when diagnosing insanity, what experts will do is they'll look for combinations of these. A person who has a depressive disorder is not insane, but a person who has a depressive disorder and is given to uncontrollable outbursts and is incapable of thinking clearly in any kind of straight line, that person might be insane. A person who has an anxiety disorder is not insane, but a person who has an anxiety disorder and thinks they cracked the secret Hebrews end times code and keeps seeing Barack Obama in her mirror as she's brushing her teeth and has absolutely no ability to relate to or build relationships with other people, so she's just kind of clinically isolated. That person might be insane. A lot of times when we're diagnosing insanity, we'll look for combinations of these. When we talk about insane people, we're usually talking about someone who has extreme delusions and has totally lost touch with reality, which is almost always accompanied by several other psychological issues like depression or anxiety or uncontrollable outbursts or paranoia or conspiratorial thinking or inability to think in coherent, sequential, logical patterns or inabilities to relate to other people or have healthy social interactions. When we talk about insanity, usually we're talking about something like that. So, based on the stories that the four Gospels tell about Jesus, does Jesus fit that description of insanity? No. Not really. When we look at the actual calling cards that experts tend to look for when they are diagnosing insanity, very few of them fit the bill for Jesus. You could maybe look at the Gospels and say Jesus might have had a depressive disorder, but you can't look at the Gospels and say Jesus had an inability to think clearly. You can't look at the Gospels and say Jesus was unable to relate to each other. You can't look at the Gospels and say Jesus was paranoid or conspiratorial or given to uncontrollable outbursts. When you look at the definition of insanity as we use it to diagnose it, Jesus just doesn't fit the bill. There are really two major reasons why Jesus doesn't fit the bill, but we're going to go into quite a few. The first major reason why insanity does not fit the bill when it comes to Jesus is that Jesus does not display the usual laundry list of psychological issues that tend to accompany the extreme delusions that skeptics accuse him of. Once again, that was a big sentence. But Jesus doesn't display the list of calling cards that tend to come with insanity. Case in point, Jesus displays a very natural, very reasonable range of human emotions. One of the things we talked about here is diagnosing insanity. You're more or less disconnected from the usual range of human emotions, right? You're given to outbursts of uncontrollable and irrational anger. You're incapable of feeling sad the way that people normally feel sad. You think in these broken lines. You're disconnected from the usual range of human emotion. But throughout the four Gospels, we see Jesus experiencing the natural emotions that you should feel as a sane person. In John chapter 12, Jesus experiences the natural sadness that comes when you lose a friend. His friend Lazarus dies. And it says Jesus did what? Wept. In the same way, he displays the natural anger that you feel when you witness something wicked or unjust. Jesus sees the way that the Pharisees and the Sadducees are exploiting the people in the synagogues. He sees the way that they're taking advantage of the people under their spiritual care. He sees the way, he says that they rob widows blind. Remember that? Jesus sees that, and the emotion he feels is the emotion you're supposed to feel. He feels natural human anger. So Jesus experiences the natural emotions that come with sanity, come with humanness. But it's also important to see what he does not experience. He does not display paranoiac tendencies. Remember, we talked about crazy Hebrew end times code lady. She was convinced she was being followed. She was convinced she was being tracked. She was convinced the government was after her because she found out who the Antichrist was going to be, when he was going to come, right? She was convinced Barack Obama was going after her with drones trying to gun her down in the streets. She was always coming to Digital Doc trying to get her secret Antichrist files restored because she was convinced the government was taking them away while she was asleep. Those are paranoiac tendencies. That's pathologically conspiratorial thinking. Those are hallmarks of diagnosable insanity, and yet Jesus specifically does not display paranoiac tendencies. And in fact, the one time he's accused of being paranoid is in John chapter 8. Jesus says, "You people are trying to kill me," to the Pharisees. Remember that? He says, "Why are you trying to kill me?" And they say, "We're not trying to kill you." What are you saying? About 12 chapters later, they try to kill him. He wasn't paranoid. He was just right. You know what I'm talking about? Like, you're not paranoid if you're right. You're not paranoid if you are correct. The thing that makes you paranoid is being wrong about the thing you're convinced is coming, right? And so, like, people who said Richard Nixon is spying on his political enemies in the the mid-60s, you might have said they were paranoid and then turned on the news and saw Watergate. And you'd say, "Oh, you weren't paranoid. You were just right." Right? If you're correct, then it's not paranoia. Jesus wasn't paranoid. Jesus was just correct that the Pharisees were trying to kill him. In the same way, we specifically do not see Jesus succumbing to delusions. Part of what makes you diagnosably insane is a delusional mindset. You see things that aren't there. You think things are true that are clearly not true, right? If you say that you talk to God through your hairdryer, right? That's delusional. If you say you talk to God while you're praying, that's perfectly reasonable. If you say that you met Jodie Foster over there in the sound booth because I've been locking her there for 3 years, ever since I got to Mount Zion, and she needs somebody to help break her out, right? That's delusional. If you say you met Jodie Foster at the airport when you both had a flight that was going to the same place, that's pretty reasonable, right? Those are different things. That's delusion. I don't know if it's a word, delusionality, delusionalness. I don't know that many words, man. But Jesus specifically doesn't display a kind of delusional mindset. One of the things that a lot of skeptics have specifically said is Jesus was delusional when he claimed to be God. But the problem with that is that you're only delusional if you're wrong about the things you believe about yourself, right? Like if I say, I believe that I am Ryan Ellington, son of Rhonda Ellington and Paul Ellington. Am I delusional? No. If I said, I am the son of Bruce Springsteen and Cyndi Lauper, am I delusional? Yes, right? You're only delusional if you you can't back up the things you believe about yourself. The problem is Jesus could back up the things he believed about himself. When he claims to be God, he can back that up. Specifically, we actually see that in action in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, Jesus claims once again to be God, and the Pharisees say, either, depending on your translation, they either say you're insane or they say you're demon-possessed. Either way, right? They're saying you're delusional. But then immediately after they say that, a bunch of people who've been following him around and watching him for the last couple of years immediately jump in and say, this man is not demon-possessed, or this man is not insane. This man is not delusional. We've watched him open the eyes of the blind. We've watched him heal the sick. We've watched him cast out demons. They say, this man is not delusional. This man can back up the things he's saying about himself. And so by all accounts, Jesus is not delusional. Delusional only counts if you can't back up your beliefs about yourself. Case in point, anybody remember the Henry Quan story from several years back? It was like global news. It was one of those news stories that was picked up almost everywhere. Henry Quan was a 17-year-old Australian kid who believed he could fly. You can guess where this is going. He told everybody, I can fly, and I'm going to prove to you that I can fly. One day he was in an argument with his mom. He lived, I guess, in a high-rise apartment. And his mom was trying to convince him that he couldn't fly because nobody can fly, right? And he said, I'm going to prove to you that I can fly. And he leapt off the balcony and like spread his arms out like wings. And then he fell however many stories down and he just splat. He was delusional. But Jesus is not like Henry Quan. When Jesus says, I am the God who heals your diseases, he backs it up by healing the sick throughout Galilee. When he says, I am the God who casts out your demons, he backs that up by casting out the demons of people who are possessed all throughout the promised land. When he says, I am the God who opens the eyes of the blind, he backs that up by finding people who've been cursed by blindness for their whole life, and he undoes their blindness. So Jesus very specifically was not delusional. He was able to back up his claims. Problem is, skeptics are industrious, right? And so, two skeptics specifically, Charles Templeton and Ian Wilson, have put forth two possible alternative explanations for the miracles of Jesus that back up his claims about himself. Does anybody remember what those two alternative explanations were? So the first one comes from Charles Templeton. Charles Templeton used to be a ministry partner of Billy Graham. I don't know if you've heard this story or not. Actually, Billy Graham was kind of the opening act for Charles Templeton before Billy Graham kind of got bigger. It's sort of like in, I believe, July of 1974, the band Kiss was opening for the Blue Oyster Cult. And in July of 1976, Blue Oyster Cult was opening for the band Kiss. Because Kiss exploded, right? And suddenly the band they used to be roadies for, now that band is kind of at their feet, right? Now that band is their opening act. Now the band they used to tour with, now they're small potatoes because Kiss is the big thing now. But it's the same kind of way. Billy Graham used to be kind of the Kiss to Charles Templeton's Blue Oyster Cult. I know this is a very edifying example, but so Charles Templeton, he was an evangelist, and he taught Billy Graham a lot of what he knew. Actually, according to a lot of people, he was a much better preacher than Billy Graham. And so Charles Templeton is an evangelist with Billy Graham, and eventually Charles Templeton loses his faith. It's a very long story, and he becomes kind of an anti-evangelist. He starts sort of evangelizing, but on the other side of the issues. He starts writing books and making videos and doing talks, trying to convince people that there is no God, that the Bible is not true, that Jesus was a fraud. And so one of the things he argues is that the miracles recorded in the Gospels could have been examples of psychosomatic illnesses.
So what changed him?
It's a good question. It's a long story. He wrote a book called Farewell to God, and he kind of lists out some of his issues, but it's really one of those things where, for most of us at least, our beliefs are not shaped by one single thing. Our beliefs are shaped by about 1,000 little things. You know what I'm talking about? And so for him, it's not exactly that he received one fatal wound in his faith. It's more that his faith died the death of 1 million little cuts. And so he goes through all the different reasons. But Charles Templeton argued that the miracles that Jesus is recorded as performing in the Gospels are examples of psychosomatic illnesses. Psychosomatic illnesses are, I have the textbook definitions written here, but I don't even understand these textbook definitions. I'm going to give you the simple version. A psychosomatic illness essentially is an illness that is in your head. Ever known somebody who had an illness that was in their head? Now, some people are just kind of hypochondriacs. They're convinced they have everything, right? I worked with a dude also at the tech repair shop, a guy named Chris. First time I ever met him, he told me he was patient 0 of Ebola. And then he tried to sell me pot. I didn't buy the pot, and I didn't buy that he was patient 0 either. But he was kind of a hypochondriac. Every time a new sickness was going around, he was convinced he had that sickness. But this is a different thing. Psychosomatic illnesses actually go beyond just like normal hypochondria. A psychosomatic illness is literally an illness that you get it in your head somehow psychologically that you have this illness, and it causes you to actually start to show symptoms of those illnesses of that illness. I forgot how to talk. But so you can get it in your head that you are unable to move. And for days or weeks or even months, you might actually not be able to move. Because even if your body works right, if your brain doesn't work right, it doesn't matter, right? Because your brain sort of controls your body. And so if you have this psychological or psychosomatic illness or handicap, it can literally prevent you from being able to do things that physically you should be able to do. And so if you ever seen the movie Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby, it's got Will Ferrell in it. He plays a NASCAR driver. It's awesome. But there's a scene about halfway through the movie, he has a crash on the NASCAR track, and he's convinced that his car's on fire. It's not on fire. And he's convinced that he's on fire, but he's not on fire. So he's like running around, he strips down to his underwear, and he's like, I'm on fire! And so like his best friend runs over with like a pretend fire extinguisher, like, pretends to put the fire out, and he's like, you saved my life! And then after that he goes to this hospital, and he's convinced that his legs don't work anymore. He's convinced that he's paraplegic now. And so he's rolling around in this wheelchair, and his managers on the NASCAR team are like, give it to me straight, Doc. Is he ever going to be able to walk again? And the doctor's like, oh no, he can walk just fine. He just found that wheelchair somewhere. He just thinks he's paraplegic now. And so they go and they're like, Ricky, the doctor just gave us great news. He says you can walk again. And Ricky's like, I cannot walk, and I can't believe you would doubt me. And so he grabs this knife, and he's like, I'm going to prove to you that I can't walk. He's like, I don't feel anything in my legs. And so he grabs the knife and just like jams it into his leg. And then he just waits for like 5 seconds. And then he just starts screaming. Because, he felt it. And it hurts really bad to be stabbed. And so he's trying to pull the knife out, but it actually hurts a lot to pull something sharp out of yourself. I don't know if you've ever had to do that before. And so his friend's kind of an idiot. He's like, I'll get another knife to dig that knife out. And so he comes and he stabs him again to try to dig the other knife out. And they finally get it all taken care of. And he's able to walk again, and then he learns how to drive again and stuff. But that's a psychosomatic illness. It's a funny example, right? It's like a satirical example, but that's a psychosomatic illness. You can convince yourself that you are this kind of sick or you are this kind of handicapped, and that can literally take over your life. That can literally prevent you from being able to do things that you could physically do. And so Charles Templeton argued that Jesus is healing psychosomatic illnesses. Now let me ask you, how convincing does that sound? Not very, right? That's a really complicated way to try to explain what's happening in the Gospels, right? But it's not just overly complicated. It also doesn't work. Does anybody know off the top of their head why that doesn't work? It's because a lot of the things that Jesus is said to have healed in the Gospels cannot be explained by psychosomatic illness. Case in point, Luke 17, Jesus heals 10 lepers. Ever seen a leper before? I wouldn't recommend Googling it, especially not right before lunch, but there are a lot of different forms of leprosy. There are a lot of different things they call leprosy, but the short version is that a leprous person is a person whose body has started rotting while they're alive. Your limbs will start falling off. Your skin withers and turns green and rots. A lot of times, if you go to a leper colony, you have to specifically not touch any of them, not just because of the contagiousness side of things, but because if you touch a leper too hard, you might make their skin slide off. You can accidentally rip the meat off of a leprous person just by holding their hand too hard. You think you can explain that purely by appealing to a psychosomatic illness? I don't think so. Luke 17, Jesus heals a colony of lepers. And I don't think you can attribute that just to a psychological problem that the lepers were having. Their skin was rotting and their limbs were falling off. And then Jesus healed them and they were healthy again. Psychosomatic illnesses don't work when you apply to that. Similar way, John 11 and 12, the Lazarus story again. You might remember from earlier. There was a man who had been dead for 4 days, and his body was in the process of decomposing. And Jesus goes to his tomb and he says, Lazarus, get up and come out. And the long dead Lazarus gets up and comes out alive. Now, a lot of people, there are stories of people who have gone into comas because they believed they were dead, right? But there are not stories of people who thought they were dead, so they started decomposing. That doesn't make sense. You can't think your way into causing your body to start shutting down and decomposing. That's not a thing that you can do. There's no psychosomatic version of that. And so Jesus literally raises a man from death to life. And you cannot explain that purely by saying Lazarus had a psychological problem. In the same way, in Mark chapter 3, one of the earliest stories about Jesus, Jesus heals a man with a shriveled hand. Like his hand has shrunk down. It looks like a tiny little prune hand, right? You ever met somebody who had a shriveled hand? That's not something you can cause to happen psychologically. You could have a psychological issue that causes you not to be able to use your hand, right? You could have a psychosomatic illness that makes it so you can't close your hand or you can't open your hand, but you cannot psychologically cause your hand literally to shrivel. You can't change the bone structure of your hand psychologically. That is not something you can appeal to psychological issues to explain. In the same way, Matthew chapter 8, one of my favorite stories in the Bible because it's just so weird. Jesus casts the demon out of a man, and where does he send the demons? Into a herd of pigs. You could potentially explain possession psychosomatically. What you can't do is explain pulling the demon out of a possessed person and then sending it into a group of pigs who then run into the ocean. How do you explain that if all of this boils down to psychosomatic illness? You don't, do you? So that's Charles Templeton's attempt at finding an alternative explanation. That doesn't work. And an even more ridiculous one comes from a guy named Ian Wilson. Ever heard of Ian Wilson? He's a British author. I believe he wrote Atonement. That was a pretty popular book about 10 years ago. You might have read that. It was in all the airport bookstores. Buy it before you get on the plane. But he's a British novelist, and he said that Jesus probably hypnotized people. Ian Wilson said that when Jesus is recorded as having performed some kind of miraculous healing or exorcism or something like that, he probably hypnotized people. Specifically for Ian Wilson, he says Jesus probably hypnotized the wedding guests at the wedding at Cana. Remember what happened at the wedding at Cana? They run out of wine. They say, we can't have a party without wine. And Jesus says, well, we can't have that. So he goes and he turns the water into wine, right? So Ian Wilson said Jesus probably hypnotized the guests at the wedding of Cana into believing that their water was wine. And does anybody know off the top of their head why the hypnotism explanation doesn't really work?
Did the guests even know they were running out of wine? And I know that the person that was hosting it didn't know he was supposed to be drinking water, right?
Yeah, so essentially the hosts run out of wine, and so they discreetly come to Jesus and say, we're running out of wine. And so Jesus goes back and he blesses the barrels of water, and then he says, here, try this. And then the wedding manager comes and he takes some and he says, hey, this is the good wine, right? As far as we know, the wedding manager doesn't even know. The guests don't even know. There wouldn't really have been an opportunity to hypnotize, but even more than that, even just at a philosophical level, the hypnotism theory doesn't work because hypnosis doesn't actually work on most people. Hypnosis is not like what you see in movies, on TV shows. It's not a superpower. It only works on people who are already susceptible to it. It's almost like, you ever seen the Star Wars movies? The Jedi mind trick, right? Like in Star Wars Episode 4, they show up in one of those places. I'm somewhat of a nerd, not that much of a nerd. Not enough to know the names of all the places, right? But so they show up in one of the places, and there's some stormtroopers, and they're looking for C-3PO and R2-D2, and they go up to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and they're like, hey, are those the droids that we're looking for? And Obi-Wan's like, these are not the droids you're looking for. And they're like, yeah, those are not the droids we're looking for. Go on, right? And then Luke says, how'd you do that? And he's like, it's the Jedi mind trick, but it only works on the weak-minded. And so later in a different Star Wars movie, a different Jedi named Qui-Gon Jinn is trying to get Anakin and his mom out of slavery. And he says, you will give me the boy and his mom. And the guy says, your Jedi mind trick doesn't work on me. It only works on the weak-minded, right? There are people who are susceptible to it, and there are people who are not susceptible to it. The same thing is true about hypnosis. Well, truer, because hypnosis is real life. The Jedi mind tricks are not real life. And so hypnosis only works on people who are already susceptible to hypnosis, and most people are not. And so if you're a magician or a hypnotist or whatever, and you're doing a public hypnotism for a crowd, what do you have to do? You have to watch the crowd really carefully. You have to pick out people in the crowd that you can tell are susceptible. And then you have to pick that person to hypnotize. Because if you pick the wrong person, what happens?
Can't do it.
Yeah. The whole act falls apart. If you pick a person who is not susceptible to hypnosis and then you try to hypnotize them, it's not going to work. So in the same way, if Jesus was doing hypnotisms to make it seem like he was doing miraculous healings or exorcisms or whatever, he could potentially have used hypnosis on like isolated individuals, but it would not have worked on a whole crowd like at the wedding at Cana. It would not have worked on a whole crowd like in the multiplication of the bread and the fish. Because most people are not susceptible to hypnosis. Lastly, I'm going to combine these two. The last two major marks of diagnosable insanity is an inability to think in clear, sequential, logical lines, right? And an inability to relate to other people, an inability to develop relationships, to interact with other humans. And yet, throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus thinking very clearly, right? Thinking very logically, thinking very sequentially, very linearly. And we see Jesus in healthy relationships with all kinds of different people from all different walks of life, right? Jesus had friends like Lazarus, friends like Mary and Martha, friends like Peter. He seemed to have a good relationship with his mom. He seemed to have a good relationship with basically anybody who wasn't trying to kill him, right? Literally, the only people that Jesus has a dysfunctional relationship with is the Pharisees and Sadducees, and not even all the Pharisees and Sadducees, right? He has a great relationship with Pharisees like Nicodemus, but a terrible relationship with Sadducees like Caiaphas or Annas, because Nicodemus was able to maintain a relationship with him, but Annas and Caiaphas were trying to murder him. And so Jesus has a whole spate of perfectly healthy relationships with people from all walks of life. These are not the marks of an insane person. When we look at the way that specialists tend to diagnose insanity, and then we look at Jesus, they don't look anything like each other. And so none of the theories that suggest that Jesus was insane hold up under investigation. And since none of the theories that say that Jesus was insane hold up under investigation, we have to reckon with both the divine claims that Jesus made about himself and the supernatural miracles that he performed to back them up. The bottom line, when you take last week plus this week, is Jesus claimed to be God, and he wasn't crazy. And he performed miraculous signs and wonders that backed up those claims. When that's the case, the ball is kind of in your court to believe it, right? Well, I need to leave about noon, but between now and then, does anybody have any questions? Well, okay. Would anybody like to pray and dismiss us?
I will.
Okay.
Father, we just thank you for another time to come together to learn more about you, Lord, and to learn more about your Son. We just thank you, Lord, for sending Jesus to save us from our sins. We just pray for those that we've named today who are sick or have other issues. We just pray, Lord, that you will heal them, that it be your will. In thy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.